Hello and welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam show. Tonight we're going to be going on with part three of the John McCain story. So you can decide whether he was a hero, a patriot, or Manchurian candidate or traitor, as some people say. We're on third part now, so we're going to be picking up where we left off last time as far as John McCain talking about his POW status. But before we get started, let's get all the information that we need to get out here. This is the Lessons of Vietnam show. I am your host, Bill Dixon. I was in Vietnam in 67, 68 during the Tet Offensive. We're broadcasting courtesy of Nissan Communications World Headquarters here in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you would like to contact me with a suggestion or you see something on the show you need to ask about, DixonBill80@yahoo.com. We ask you to, if you'd like to participate in the show while we're doing the show, you can call in at 919-518-9773, or even better, come in on Computers 2K Voice on Skype. That's Computers 2K Voice, as you see there on the screen. That way we can talk back and forwards, ask questions or whatever. Everything you see on here is me, no other organization I'm a member of, so forth, had anything to do with the information. I stand with the Patriot Guard whenever I can, and I have recently stood for two young men who committed suicide. So the Veterans Crisis Line, especially with all the things going on in the country right now between the protests out there, the virus, quarantines, and everything else, there's a lot of pressure out there on a lot of people, especially veterans and so forth. So I highly encourage you, if you are a veteran, call the number that you can see there on the screen. If you know someone who knows a veteran, if you know someone that's a veteran and they having some problems getting through this, please have them to call this number. Just no reason to get out there and do those things when someone is waiting for you to help. So getting right into the show. All right. Let me tell you a little bit about how the show got started and so forth. The Lessons of Vietnam school curriculum was founded by Bob Matthews and North Carolina Vietnam Veterans Incorporated, was put together to help dispel the many myths of Americans involved in the Vietnam War. This online show is continuation of efforts. Bob Matthews and I started this show with the assistance of Amnon Nissan's broadcasting facilities. No salaries or budget, just a desire for the truth to be told. Bob has retired and moved back to Pennsylvania, leaving Amnon and myself to continue this mission. And it's a mission we work real hard to keep out there, trying to make sure we have the truth. And the reason I put this in, because I'm not certain what the truth is. I have done a lot of reading, I've done a lot of researching, and I'm not certain what the truth is with these last two shows we're doing, or the whole series on John McCain. And I'm going to let you make up your own mind. As it says here, all this being said, Lessons of Vietnam show strives always to give you the real story and invite any corrections by our audience. And I'm doing it again tonight. But this episode will be a lot different, mainly because I'm not sure if anyone knows the real truth is related to our subject, or if the real truth will ever be known. Life is not a black and white story. You can notice that now. There's a lot of gray, and nobody can really stand up to a total scrutiny of their thoughts and life choices, or to say none of us is perfect, except maybe Amnon. Now, this was the dialogue that, or the article that John McCain wrote about his time as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He was not always in the Hanoi Hilton. He was in several others. The Rabbit, they named their guards different names. Rabbit was one of them, and he's talking here. The Rabbit and others worked on Dick Stratton, that's Dick in the picture, very hard. He's got huge rope scars on his arms where they were infected. They really wrung him out because they were going to get a confession that he had bombed Hanoi. This was to be living proof. They also peeled his thumbnails back and burned him with cigarettes. Dick reached a point where he couldn't say no. But when they got him to the press conference, he pulled his bowing act on them. He bowed 90 degrees in this direction, he bowed 90 degrees in that direction, and 4 quadrants. This was not too wild to the Gooks because they are used to the bowing thing. That's one of the things they made the prisoners do, or tried to, is have them to bow into them whenever they're around. But any American who sees a picture of another American bowing to the waist every turn for 90 degrees knows there's something wrong with the guy. That something has happened to him. That's why Dick did what he did, and after they continued to keep pressures on him to say he wasn't tortured, they tortured him to say that he wasn't tortured. It gets to be a bad merry-go-round to be on. Dick made some very strong statements at his press conference here in the States a few weeks ago. He said he wanted the North Vietnamese charged with war crimes. He's a fine man. He and I were at the plantation together for a long time, and he did a very fine job there. He's an outstanding naval officer, a very dedicated American, and a deeply religious man. There he is bowing for the press conference. I think a great deal of Dick Stratton. He just was very, very unfortunate getting the worst that Gooks could dish out. We had a particularly bad spring and summer in 1969 because they had been an escape at one of the other camps. Our guys carried out a well-prepared plan but were caught. They were Ed Attenbury and John Dromacy. Attenbury was beaten to death after the escape. There's no question about it. Dromacy saw Attenbury taken into a room and heard the beating start. Attenbury never came out. Dromacy, if he wasn't such a tough cookie, would probably have been killed too. He's probably one of the toughest guys I've ever met. From South Philly, his old man was a pro boxer and he was a wrestler himself. Reprisals took place all through other camps. They started torturing us for our escape plans. If you didn't have one, they were going to find one. The food got worse. The room inspections became very severe. You couldn't have anything in your room, nothing. For example, they used to give us once in a while a little vial of iodine because many of us had boils. Now they wouldn't even let us have it because Dromacy and Attenbury had used iodine to darken their skins before they tried to escape, so they would look like Vietnamese. That summer, from May to about September at our camp, twice a day for 6 days a week, all we had was pumpkin soup and bread. That's a pretty rough diet. First, because you get awfully damn tired of pumpkin soup, amen, but also became it doesn't have any real nutritional value. The only thing that could keep any weight on you was the bread, which was full of lumps of soggy flour. That is a picture of Ed Attenbury, who was beat to death. On Sunday, we got what we call sweet bean soup. They would take small beans and throw them in a pot with lots of sugar and cook it up with no meat whatsoever. A lot of us became thin and emancipated. I had the singular misfortune to get caught communicating 4 times in the month of May in 1969. They had a punishment room right across the courtyard from my cell, and I ended up spending a lot of time over there. It was also in May of 1969 that they wanted me to write, as I remember, a letter to U.S. pilots who were flying over North Vietnam, asking them not to do it. I was being forced to stand up continuously. Sometimes they'd make you stand up or sit on a stool for a long period of time. I stood up for a couple of days without a respite, only because of one of the guards, the only real human being that I ever met over there, let me lie down for a couple of hours while he was on watch the middle of one night. One of the strategies we worked out was not to let them make you break yourself. If you get tired of standing, just sit down. Make them force you up. So I sat down, and this little guard, who was a particularly hateful man, came in and jumped up and down on my knees. After this, I had to go back on a crutch for the next year and a half. That was a long, difficult summer. Then suddenly, in October 1969, there were drastic changes around the camp. The torture stopped. The soft soap fairy, another one of the guards, came to my room one day and told me that I would get a roommate. The food improved greatly, and we started getting extra rations. The guards seemed almost friendly. For example, I had a turnkey. guard who used to just bash me around for drill. The door would open, he'd come in and start slugging me. They stopped that kind of thing. I attributed all this directly to the propaganda effort that was directed by the administration and the people in the United States in 1969. My younger brother, Joe, was very active in the National League of Families of American Prisoners of War and Missing in Action in Southeast Asia. That was the umbrella for all POW family groups. So he has filled me in on why the North Vietnamese attitude towards the American prisoners changed and given me this information. It also may have something to do, I do not remember exactly the date, but the Song Tay raid made a big difference. As the bombing of the North picked up in 1965 and 1966, Hanoi made its first propaganda display by parading beaten, subjugated American pilots through the street. To their surprise, the press reaction around the world was generally negative, because as they were walking along, the people Hanoi were throwing rocks and beating them with sticks. Next, the North Vietnamese tried to attack, forcing Commander Dick Stratton to appear and apologize for war crimes. But he had obviously been mistreated and was doing this only under extreme duress. That backfired too. They followed this by releasing two groups of 3 POWs in February and October of 1968. These men had been there less than 6 months and had suffered no significant weight loss and were in pretty good shape. So it looked good for the cameras. Until the Nixon administration came to office in 1969, the government back home had taken the attitude, don't talk about the prisoner of war situation unless you hurt the Americans still over there. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird early in 1969 went over to the peace talks with North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in Paris. Talks had begun under President Johnson in late 1968. Laird took pictures of severely beaten men such as Frischman, Stratton, Hengdahl, all of whom had suffered extreme weight loss. He got the photos through Foreign News Service. He told the North Vietnamese, the Geneva Convention says that you shall release all sick and wounded prisoners. These men are sick and wounded. Why aren't they released? In August 1969, Hanoi let Frischman come home. He had no elbow, just a limp, rubbery arm, and he had lost 65 pounds. Hengdahl came out and had lost 75 pounds. Hengdahl was given a task of memorizing the names and social security numbers of all the prisoners there so they could check it when he got back to find out who was actually prisoners there. He had special permission to leave. Also released was Wes Rumball, who was in a body cast because of a broken back. Frischman was allowed to hold a press conference and spilled out the details of torture and maltreatment. Headlines appeared all over the world. And from then on, starting in the fall of 1969, the treatment began to improve. We think this was directly attributed to the fact that Frischman was living proof of the mistreatment of Americans. I'm proud of the part Joe and my wife Carol played here at home. The temptation for the wise as the years went on by was to say, God, I want them home under any circumstances. When Carol was pressed to take this line, her answer was, just to get him home is not enough for me, and it's not enough for John. I want him to come home standing up. I received very few letters from Carol. I got 3 in the first 4 months after I was shot down. The Gooks let me have only 1 during the last 4 years. I was there. I received my first package in May of 1969, and after that, they let me have approximately 1 a year. That was a goodie package that was being able to sit from home. The reason I got so little mail was that Carol insisted on using the channel provided by the Geneva Convention for treatment of prisoners of war. She refused to send things through the Committee for Liaisons with families run by the anti-war groups. This brings me to something that I want to discuss even more details. As you may know, back in 1954, the North Vietnamese had a big hand in toppling the French government in Paris because the French voters had no more stomach for the Vietnam War their government was waging at that time. That was the way North Vietnamese won in 1954. They didn't win in Vietnam. Sounding familiar. The French agreed to pull out of Indochina with no questions asked, where they signed the agreement. As a result, they got back just 1/3 of their POWs. I'm convinced that Hanoi hoped to win in our case by undermining morale among the people at home in America. They had to marshal world opinion on their side. I remember in 1968 or 69, North Vietnam Premier Pham Van Dong's speech to the National Assembly, because we were blasted with these things on the loudspeakers. The title of his address was, "The Whole World Supports Us." Not, "We have defeated U.S. aggressors," or anything like that. Just that the world supported them. In 1969, after the 3 guys who were released went back to the United States and told about the brutality in the POW camps, President Nixon gave the green light to publicizing this fact. It brought a drastic change in our treatment. And I thank God for it, because if it hadn't been for that, a lot of us would never have returned. Just one small example of the way things improved. Over my door were some bars covered by a wooden board to keep me from seeing out and to block ventilation. One night around the end of September 1969, Slopehead, the camp commander himself, came around and pulled this thing off so that I could have some ventilation. I couldn't believe it. Every night from then on, they pulled that transom so I could get some ventilation. We started bathing more often. It was all very amazing. In December of 1969, I was moved from the Pentagon over to Las Vegas. Las Vegas was a smaller area of Wallah Prison, which was built by the French in 1945. It was also known as the Hanoi Hilton to Americans. Heartbreak Hotel is also there. That's the first place that people were usually taken for their initial interrogation and then funneled out to other camps. This whole prison is an idea. Is an area of about 2 city blocks. At Las Vegas, I was put in a small building of just 3 rooms called the Golden Nugget. We named the building after the hotels in Vegas. There were Thunderbird, Stardust, Riviera, Gold Nugget, and the Desert Inn. That is John McCain on one of his trips back to Hanoi after when he was a senator, and he's there looking at information about him on the wall there in the prison. I was moved into Golden Nugget, and immediately I was able to establish communication with the men around the camp, because the bath area was right out my window and I could see through cracks in the door of the bath, and we would communicate that way. I stayed in that one in solitary confinement until March 1970, and that is a book about the tap code that they use to communicate from cell to cell. There was pressure to see American anti-war delegations, which seemed to increase as the time went on. But wasn't any torture. In January of 1970, I was taken to a quiz with the cat. He told me that he wanted me to see a foreign guest. I told him what I had always told him before, that I would see the visitor, but I would not say anything against my country, and if I was asked about my treatment, I would tell them how harsh it was. Much to my surprise, he said, "Fine, you don't have to say anything." I told him I'd have to think about it. I went back to my room and I was asked a senior American officer in our area what his opinion was, and he said he thought that I should go ahead. Now, they had the military structure there in the prisons. You were by rank. The top man was the senior officer, and it went right on down the rank just like that. So whoever was the top ranking man with time and grade, he was the man that everything had to go through. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I went to see this visitor who said he was from Spain, but who I later heard was from Cuba. He never asked me any questions about controversial subjects or my treatment or my feelings about the war. I told him I had no remorse about what I did, and that I would do it over again if the same opportunity presented itself. That seemed to make him angry, because he was a sympathizer of the North Vietnamese. At the time this happened, a photographer came in and took a couple of pictures. I had told the cat that I didn't want any such publicity. So when I came back, the interview had lasted about 15 to 20 minutes. I told him I wasn't going to see another visitor because he had broken his word. Also at that time, Captain Jeremiah Denton, who was running our camp at the time, established a policy that we should not see any delegations. If you remember, Jeremiah Denton was the POW who blinked torture when he was making him to give a statement, and he blinked through Morse code torture. In March, I got a roommate, Colonel John Finley, Air Force. He and I lived together for approximately 2 months. A month after he moved in, the cat told me I was going to see another delegation. I refused and was forced to sit on a stool in the Heartbreak Courtyard area for 3 days and nights. Then I was sent back to my room. The pressure continued on us to see anti-war delegations. By early in July 1st, I was moved away from Colonel Finley to a room they called Calcutta, about 50 yards away from the nearest prisoner. It was 6 feet by 2 feet with no ventilation in it, and it was very hot. During the summer, I suffered from heat prostration a couple of or 3 times and dysentery. I was very ill. Washing facilities were non-existent. My food was cut down to about half rations. Sometimes I'd go for days or so without eating. That was Finley. All during this time was taken out to interrogation and pressure to see the anti-war people. I refused. Finally, I moved in September to another room, which is back in the camp, but separated from everything else. That was what we called the Riviera. I stayed in there until December 1970. I had good communications because there was a door facing the outside and a kind of louvered window above it. I used to stand on my bucket, was able to take up my toothbrush and flash the code to other prisoners, and they would flash back to me. In December, I moved into Thunderbird, one of the big buildings with about 15 rooms in it. The communication was very good. We'd tap between rooms. I learned a lot about acoustics. You can tap if you get the right spot on the wall, and I hear a guy 4 or 5 rooms away. There were 4 or 5 guys who were not in good shape that were kept separated from us. The Colonels Flynn, Wynn, Bean, and Caddis also were kept separate. They did not move. They did not move in with us at that time. Our den mother was the bug. Again, much to our displeasure, he made life very difficult for us. He wouldn't let us have meetings or more than 3 people at a time. Sounds like now with a virus. They were afraid we were going to set up a political indoctrination. They wouldn't let us have church service. The bug would not recognize our senior officer's rank. This is one thing that they did right up until the end, till the day we left. If they had worked through our seniors, they would have gotten cooperation out of us. This was a big source for irritation all the time. In March of 1971, the senior officers decided they would also have a showdown over church. This was an important issue for us. It also was a good one to fight them on. We went ahead and held church. The men that were conducting the service were taken out of the room immediately. We began singing hymns in loud voices in the Star Spangled Banner. The gooks thought it was a riot situation. They brought in the ropes and were practically judo holes and that kind of stuff. After about a week or 2, they started taking the senior officers out of our room and putting them in another building. Later in March, they came in and took 3 or 4 of us out of every one of the 7 rooms until they got 36 of us out. We were put in a camp called Skid Row, a punishment camp. We stayed there from March until August, when we came back for about 4 weeks because of flooding conditions around Hanoi, and then we went back out again until November. They didn't treat us badly there. The guards had permission to knock us around if we were unruly. However, they did not have permission to start torturing us for propaganda statements. The rooms were very small, about 6 feet by 4 feet, and were in solitary again. The most unpleasant thing about it was thinking of all our friends living in a big room together. but compared with 69 and before, it was a piece of cake. The great advantage to living in a big room is that way only a couple of 3 guys out of the group have to deal with the gooks. When you're living by yourself, then you've got to deal with them all the time. You always have some fight with them. Maybe you're allowed 15 minutes to bathe, and the gook will say in 5 minutes, you've got to go back. So you have an argument with him, and he locks you in your room, and so you don't get to bathe for a week. But when you're in a big room with others, you can stay out of contact with them, and it's a lot more pleasant. All through this period, the gooks were bombarding us with anti-war quotes from people in high places back in Washington. This was the most effective propaganda they had to use against us. Speeches and statements by men who were generally respected in the United States. They used Senator Fulbright a great deal and Senator Brooke. Ted Kennedy was quoted again and again, as was Abraham Harriman, and Clark Clifford was another favorite, right after he had been Secretary of Defense under President Johnson. When Ramsey Clark came over, they thought that was a great coup for their cause. The big furor over release of the Pentagon Papers was a tremendous boost for Hanoi. It was advanced as proof of the black imperialist schemes that they had been taking talking about all those years. Pentagon Papers was classified documents stolen from the Pentagon. Was papers put together about the war and how it was conducted and so forth. Exposed government knowledge that the war would cost more lives than the public was being told. It was brought out by Daniel Ellsberg and published. So it created a real furor all the way around. In November of 1971, we came back from Skid Row, and they put us in one of the big rooms again in the main prison. This was Camp Unity. From that time on, we pretty much stayed as a group with some other people who were brought in later. We ended up with about 40 men in their rooms. In May of 1972, when the U.S. bombing started again in earnest, they moved almost all the junior officers up to the camp near the China border, leaving the senior officer in our group behind. That was when President Nixon announced the resumption of the bombing of North Vietnam and the mining of the ports, sometimes called the Christmas bombing. Dogpat was the name of the camp near the border. I think they were afraid that Hanoi would be hit, and with all of us together in one camp, one bomb could have wiped us out. At this time, the gooks got a little bit rougher. They once took a guy out of a room and beat him up very badly. This man had made a flag on the back of another man's shirt. He was a fine young man by the name of Mike Christian. They just pounded the hell out of him right outside of our room, and then carried him a few feet and then pounded him again and pounded him all the way across the courtyard. Busted one of his eardrums and busted his ribs. It was to be a lesson for us all. And after they confiscated that flag, he made another one, but just kept it hid, which he presented to Nixon after they came home. Aside from bad situations now and then, in 1971 and 72 was a sort of coasting period. The reason why you see our men in such good condition today is that the food and everything generally improved. For example, in 69, I was down to 105, 110 pounds. Boils all over me, suffering dysentery. We started getting packages with vitamins in them, about 1 package a year. We're able to exercise quite a bit in our rooms and managed to get back into a lot better health. My health has improved radically. In fact, I think I'm in better physical shape than I was when I got shot down. I can do 45 push-ups and a couple of hundred sit-ups. And another beautiful thing about exercise, it makes you tired and you can sleep. And when you're asleep, you're not there, you know. I used to try to exercise all the time. Finally came the day I'll never forget, the 18th of December, 1972. The Christmas bombings ordered by President Nixon began. They hit Hanoi right off the bat. The whole place exploded. You can see the bombers coming in. You see the anti-aircraft guns. The bomb shelters, the individual bomb shelters were in the streets of Hanoi, where they could pull the cover off and kind of go down in there, but you can see the results of the bombing and so forth in the picture. And this is a picture of the pilots and crews who were shot down during the Christmas bombing. Press photo from the Vietnam News Agency of unidentified American pilots in 1973, all shot down during the 1272 Christmas bombings that proved to be the last bombing of Hanoi in the war. The most spectacular show I ever see. By then, we had large windows in our rooms. These had been covered with bamboo mats, but in October 1972, they took them down. We had about a 120-degree view of the sky, and of course, at night, you can see all the flashes. The bombs were dropping so close that the building would shake. The SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, were flying all over, and the sirens were whining. It was really a wild scene. When a B-52 would get hit, they're up at almost 30,000 feet. It would light up the whole sky. There would be a red glow that almost made it like daylight. And it would last for a long time because they'd fall a long way. We knew at that time that unless something very forceful was done, they were never going to get out of there. We had sat there for 3.5 years with no bombing going on. November of 68 to May of 72. We were fully aware that the only way that we were ever going to get out was for our government to turn the screws on Hanoi. So we were very happy. We were cheering and hollering. The gooks didn't like that at all, but we didn't give a damn about that. It was obvious to us that the negotiations were not going to settle the problem. The only reason why North Vietnamese began negotiating in October 72 was because they could not read the polls as well as you and I can. And they knew that Nixon was going to have an overwhelming victory in his re-election bid. So they wanted to negotiate a ceasefire before the elections. I admire President Nixon's courage. There may be criticism of him in certain areas, Watergate, for example, but he had to take the most unpopular decisions that I could imagine. The mining, the blockade, the bombing. I know it was very difficult for him to do that, but that was the thing that ended the war. I think the reason he understood this is that he has a long background in dealing with these people. He knows how to use the carrot and the stick. Obviously, his trip to China and the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with Russia was based on the fact that we're stronger than the communists, so they were willing to negotiate. Force is what they understand. And that's why it's difficult for me to understand now, when everybody knows that the bombing finally got a ceasefire agreement, while people are still criticizing his foreign policy. For example, the bombing of Cambodia. Right after the Communist Tet Offensive in 1968, the North Vietnamese were riding high. They knew President Johnson was going to stop the bombings before the 1968 elections. The South Soap Ferry told me a month before these elections that Johnson was going to stop the bombings. In May of 1968, I was interviewed by 2 North Vietnamese generals at separate times. Both of them said to me in almost these words, after we liberate South Vietnam, we're going to liberate Cambodia. And after we liberate Cambodia, we're going to Laos. And after we liberate Laos, we're going to liberate Thailand. And after we liberate Thailand, we're going to liberate Malaysia and then Burma. We're going to liberate all of Southeast Asia. They left no doubt in my mind that it was not a question of South Vietnam alone. Some people's favorite game is to refute the domino theory. But the North Vietnamese themselves never tried to refute it. They believed it. Ho Chi Minh said many, many times, we are proud to be in the front line of armed struggle between the socialist camp and the U.S. imperialist aggressors. Now, this doesn't mean fighting for nationalism. It doesn't mean fighting for an independent South Vietnam. It means that this is what communism is all about. Armed struggle to overthrow the capitalists. You can see the dominoes there as Vietnam fell and all the others would fall. I read a lot of the history. They gave us propaganda books. I learned that Ho Chi Minh was a Stalinist. When Khrushchev denounced Stalin in the late 1950s, men did not go along with it. He was not a peaceful coexistence communist. At this particular juncture, after Tet 1968, they thought they had the war won. They had gotten General Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. forces in South Vietnam, fired. They were convinced they had wrecked Johnson's chances for re-election, and they thought that they had the majority of the American people on their side. That's why these guys were speaking very freely as to what their ambitions were. They were speaking prematurely because they had just misjudged the caliber of President Nixon. To go back to December bombings, initially the North Vietnamese had a hell of a lot of SAMs on hand. I soon saw a lessening in the SAM activities, meaning they may have used them up. Also, the B-52 bombings, which were mainly right around Hanoi in the first few days, spread out around from the city because I think they destroyed all the military targets around Hanoi. I don't know the number of B-52 crewmen shot down then because they only took the injured Americans to our camp. The attitude of our men was good. I talked to them the day before we moved out, preparing to go home. When they knew the agreements were going to be signed, I asked one young pilot, class of 70 at West Point, how did your outfit feel when you were told that the B-52s were going to bomb Hanoi? He said, our morale skyrocketed. I have heard there were one B-52 pilot who refused to fly the missions during the Christmas bombing. You always run into that kind. When the going gets tough, they find out their conscience is bothering them. I want to say this to anybody in the military. If you don't know what your country is doing, find out. If you find you don't like what your country is doing, get out before the chips are down. Once you become a prisoner of war, then you do not have the right to dissent, because what you do will be harming your country. You are no longer speaking as an individual. You are speaking as a member of the armed forces of the United States, and you owe loyalty to the commander-in-chief, not to your own conscience. Some of my fellow prisoners sang a different tune, but they were a very small minority. I asked myself if they should be prosecuted, and I don't find that easy to answer. It might destroy the very fine image the great majority of us have brought back from that hellhole. Remember, a handful of turncoats around the Korean War made a great majority of Americans think that most of the POWs in conflict were traitors. If these men are tried, it should not be because they took an anti-war stance, but because they collaborated with the Vietnamese to an extent, and that was harmful to the other American POWs. And there is this to consider. America will have other wars to fight until the communists give up their doctrine of violent overthrow of our way. These men should bear some censure so that in future wars they won't be a precedent for conduct that hurts the country. By late January of this year, we knew the end of the war was near. I was moved then to the plantation. We were put in groups by the period from when we were shot down. They were getting us ready to return by groups. By the way, a very interesting thing. After I got back, Henry Kissinger told me that when he was in Hanoi to sign the final agreement, the North Vietnamese offered him one man that he could take back to Washington with him, and that was me. He, of course, refused, and I thanked him very much for that because I did not want to go out of order. Most guys were betting that I'd be the last guy out, but you never can fathom the goose. It was January 20th when we moved back to the plantation. From then on, it was very easy. They hardly bothered us. We were allowed out all day in the courtyard, but typically of them, we had a real bad food for about 2 weeks before we left. Then they gave us a great big meal the night before that we went home. And as you can see there, they had special outfits made, kind of a wind jacket and pants and all made for the prisoners. And that is the camp commander giving them a speech as they're getting ready to come home. They came home in different flights by time as prisoners. There was no special ceremony when we left camp. The International Control Commission came in and we were permitted to look around the camp. There were a lot of photographers around, but nothing no formal. Then we got on the buses and went to GLM Airport. My old friend, the rabbit, was there. He stood out front and said to us, "When I read your name off, you get on that plane and go home." That was March 15th. Up to that moment, I wouldn't allow myself more than a feeling of cautious hope. We had been picked up so many times before that I had decided that I wouldn't get excited until I shook hands with an American in uniform. That happened in GLM. And then I knew it was over. There's no way I can describe how I felt as I walked towards that U.S. Air Force plane. Now that I'm back, I find a lot of hand-wringing around this country. I don't buy that. I think America today is a better country than the one I left nearly 6 years ago. The North Vietnamese gave us very little except bad news about the United States. We didn't find out about the first successful moonshot in 1969 until it was mentioned in a speech by George McGovern saying that Nixon could put a man on the moon, but he couldn't put an end to the Vietnam War. That is them getting on the plane. They were being told they have just left the Vietnamese airspace. As you can see, everybody is hollering and relaxing after being prisoners of war. They knew then they were going home. They bombarded us with news of Martin Luther King's death and the riots that followed. Information like that poured continuously out of the loudspeakers. I think America is a better country now because we have been through a sort of purging process, a reevaluation of ourselves. Now I see more of an appreciation of our way of life. There's more patriotism. The flag is all over the place. I hear new values being stressed. The concern for environmental is a case in point. I received scores of letters from young people, and many of them sent me POW bracelets with my name on it, which they had been wearing. Some were not too sure about the war, but they were strongly patriotic. Their values are good, and I think we will find that they are going to grow up and to be better Americans than many of us. There's one of the John McCain bracelets that was very popular for people to wear. This outpouring on behalf of us were prisoners of war is staggering. And a little embarrassing because basically we feel that we were just average American Navy, Marine, and Air Force pilots who got shot down. Anybody else in our place would have performed just as well. My own plans for the future are to remain in the Navy. If I am able to return to flying status, that depends on whether the corrective surgery on my arms and legs is successful. If I have to leave the Navy, I hope to serve the government in some capacity, preferably in foreign service for the State Department. I had a lot of time to think it over there and came to the conclusion that one of the most important things in life, along with the man's family, is to make some contribution to the country. John McCain was free again, but his poorly mended bones required extensive surgery and ultimately grounded him to a desk job. Yet as one career ended, another began. In 1977, McCain was assigned to the Navy to be the Navy's liaison to the U.S. Senate, a perfect gig for a guy interested in politics. Now, what I just went over was the statement John McCain made about his time as a POW. Now, we're going to get into a mixture of people speaking for McCain and people speaking against McCain. We are not going to be using his words as much. If it is, I'll let you know. It was an easy transition for McCain, who had been raised amid dignitaries. His office quickly became the party spot on the Hill. But from the start, POW MIA Nicks took a dim view of McCain. This is some of the questions. John McCain, war hero. True or did he sell out fellow pilots for special treatment? Captured in 1967, this picture of McCain 3 years later, as you can see, is well-fed and looks good compared to the other POWs that are shown there that are skin and bones just about. There he is coming home healthy, which all of them look like they were pretty healthy coming home except for the wounds as far as the broken bones and so forth. How did now Senator John McCain Arizona remained so healthy during the 5 years? Okay, that's a question some of his distractors will have. This is some of the posters that have been out there. Sonberg McCain, traitor, gave information that led to the downing of 60 U.S. aircraft, trained North Vietnamese air defense personnel, made over 30 propaganda broadcasts against the United States, which he moved to have classified when he was elected to the Senate. Google McCain in captivity for all you can stomach of this bogus media made zero. And you can go to Google and look up Songbird and so forth and read it for yourself. I think this Cyrus report is interesting. Here it says that the real Senator John McCain was unveiled. So what is the real story? What is the truth? If you look here, it says here that he was his own Air Force. He crashed 5 aircraft of his own Air Force. If the information this magazine had was so good, they would have known he was in the Navy. But it's out there. Like so many things in life, no person is all good or bad. Now let's look at what more of his fellow POWs and people he dealt with in his life as a United States Senator. Now we're going what other people thought about him. This is an excerpt from an article by Zaylan Grant, and it was called "Did He Show the Right Stuff?" Streets of Saigon. After the Forrestal aircraft carrier fire, and if you go back to the first show, you'll talk about the Forrestal aircraft carrier fire, one of the worst in history. John McCain was reassigned to Saigon as a Navy public relations aide. There he met a reporter for the New York Times who helped him assimilate into Saigon life by introducing McCain to the U.S. military and civilian command and the journalists covering the war. John McCain could very well have served out his tour as a public relations officer, living a good life in Saigon, enjoying eating in the French restaurants and bars filled with Vietnamese girls. But having flown only 5 missions after being assigned to the Forrestal, McCain wanted to get back into combat. Remember, he wanted to get into politics. 2 months after the Forrestal fire and a month before being shot down, John McCain was assigned to USS Orensky. His fellow pilots on board had mixed feelings about his flying abilities, as his reputation had preceded him. The commander of the fighter squadron VF-162 on board, Cal Swanson, was excited and thinking McCain had what it took by asking to be assigned to the Orensky, a carrier that had seen more combat and suffered more casualties than any other ship in the war. And that's a picture of the Orensky. As a trained A-4 bomber, pilot McCain was assigned to an attack squadron, not VA-163, which was the fighter squadron. So McCain was a bomber. Nanton Swanson's fighter squadron had been commanded by legendary James Stockdale, Admiral Stockdale, who ran for ran for vice president with Ross Perot. Stockdale, before he shot down and became a POW, he's got quite a story himself. Some of his fellow pilots had bad reviews, and was not all McCain's fault. John McCain III was considered to be born with 2 silver spoons in his mouth. McCain's grandfather, John Sidney McCain, was a highly decorated admiral in World War II. His father, John S. McCain Jr., who was also an admiral and would later during John McCain's time as a POW become the highest ranking officer of the war as Commander-in-Chief of the Air Force in Pacific. For a Navy pilot to crash a plane was pushing the line. Crashing 2 usually resulted in an official investigation to determine if the pilot should be taken off flight status. McCain crashing 2 planes and destroying power lines in Spain led to other pilots feeling if his continuing flight status had a lot to do with his family name. McCain also developed a reputation for being very volatile with a quick temper and was given to flare-ups over minor incidents. On the Orensky, the pilots watched each other like hawks, making sure the other pilots didn't get more missions over in Vietnam than they did. Everybody was out there to get their ticket punches, we say. To survive the risky missions, they developed tactics to beat the surface-to-air missiles and the anti-aircraft fire. These were all well seasoned and professionally, and only the best of the best would be promoted to the next rank. So everybody wanted to look good because they can get promoted. Sometimes, no matter what tactics you used or how lucky you were shot down. Thus, you lost your position for promotion. The number one gripe of the pilots was they felt they were risking their lives to attack insignificant targets. It's been said that we bombed a lot of empty rice paddies. President Johnson made all the decisions of what to attack or not to attack. And Hanoi was generally in the don't category. When orders came down on 26th of October 1967 to attack the thermal power plant in Hanoi, everyone in Lawrence got excited. McCain's squadron operation officer had given him the nickname of Gregory Greenass, since McCain had only flown 22 missions, much less than his fellow pilots. As this was to be a big mission, McCain begged and pleaded with the operations officer to be assigned to this Hanoi mission. This mission had the nomenclature of an Alpha Strike, the designation reserved for the most important attacks on Hanoi. The attack group consisted of 20 aircraft from various squadrons from Lawrence. The North Vietnamese were prepared. They fired 22 SAMs and a return of anti-aircraft fire. McCain says in his book, Faith of My Fathers, I recognized a target sitting close to the small lake from the intelligence photographs I had studied. I dove in, and just as the tone went off, the signal that a SAM was flying towards me. I knew I should roll out and fly evasive maneuvers, but I was just about to release my bombs when the tone sounded, and I started jinking, maneuvering to avoid missile. I would never had this time probably the nerve to go back once I lost the SAM. So at about 3,500 feet, I released my bombs, then pulled back the stick to begin the steep climb to a safer altitude. In the instant before my reaction, a SAM blew my wing off. I was killed. By his own admission, McCain failed to do the SAM evasive maneuvers he had been taught. One of the pilots flying near McCain with a handheld camera said he was not hit by SAM, that because McCain was flying too low, he was brought down by a barrage of anti-aircraft. And you can see an anti-aircraft picture there. John McCain made another error in judgment in the critical moments he was hit. That was, he failed to use the proper ejection procedure that he had been taught for ejecting. This failure caused critical injuries. He broke both arms and his leg. McCain describes his ejection later like this. I reacted automatically. The moment I was hit and saw my wing gone, I radioed, I'm hit, reach up and pull the ejection seat handle. I struck part of the airplane, breaking my left arm, my right arm in 3 places, and my right knee, and I was briefly knocked unconscious by the force of the ejection. As you can see the picture there is the pilot being ejected. It's like sitting on the bomb. Upon it landing in Trubach Lake, McCain in the middle of Hanoi sank quickly, but after making it to the surface, he inflated his life vest and passed out. McCain stated when he regained consciousness, he was hauled to shore on 2 bamboo poles by the Vietnamese. In all probability, John McCain's life was saved by his rescuers. McCain was candid in admitting that the injuries caused by his ejection, particularly his knee injury, drove him to try to bargain with his interrogators. He told them he would give them information if they took him to a hospital. He claimed he did not intend to keep his word, but he, like Chuck Rice, who shot down about the same time as McCain, James Stockdale, and every American POW in Hanoi, was broken. McCain did what the communists demanded. He signed and made taped statements that he could be used as propaganda against the United States. There is no question that McCain was beaten and tortured and underwent brutal experience. He put it this way in his book, Faith of Our Fathers. I also suspect that my treatment was less harsh than might be accorded other prisoners. This I attributed to my father's position and the propaganda value that North Vietnamese placed on possession me. I injured all but alive, Later, my suspicions were confirmed when I heard accounts of another POW's experience during their first interrogation. They had endured far worse than I had endured the cruelest torture imaginable. Ironically, McCain became the beneficiary of his mistakes as a pilot when his political career took off. Even though the official record stated he was shot down by anti-aircraft, he always claimed he was shot down by SAM. The American voters knew about the terrifying SAM missiles, but not about the proven tactics to evade them. A pilot who served with McCain was quoted to say, "I guess the SAM sounds better, but I think it's a moot point." There was another misperception by the American public about McCain's refusal of an early release offered him by the North Vietnamese. Even though Time magazine wrote that McCain was the only POW to have languished in a North Vietnamese prison in order for years rather than accept an early release because he felt it was dishonorable, he was not. The fact was that John McCain was a part of a still functioning U.S. military chain of command and had three choices. One, he could ask his American senior ranking officer for his permission to accept an early release and abide by the yes or no decision. Two, he could decide on his own to violate regulations against accepting early release and possibly face censure when all POWs were freed. Three, he could have quickly said no to the offer. This was not about John McCain's honor as it has been made to appear, nor was it about his personnel or whether he to accept an early release. As a propaganda ploy that North Vietnamese also offered an early release to other POWs, it was about his own sworn duty as a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, just like the 590 other American POWs being held. The POWs had set up a military organization and prison communication was by the TAP code. Leadership was set up just as all U.S. military is set up, by rank and date of rank. McCain knew that Air Force Colonel Ted Guy was the senior ranking officer during their time at the plantation in the prison camp. Colonel Guy was a stickler for the rules and discipline. After their release, he brought charges against several POWs for collaborating with the enemy. Charges were later dropped. Guy felt that no one should get an early release unless they were very sick or wounded, and felt but never said John McCain was badly wounded might be an exception. But McCain did not ask Colonel Guy for permission. And as under the established military system, Colonel Guy had the authority to decide whether John McCain or anyone else could accept an early release, not John McCain. McCain's personal struggle with the decision was so much detailed, he talks about it in his book, Faith of Our Fathers, was irrelevant to the actual situation. If he had agreed to leave early, he would have been violating standard regulations and be subject to future disciplinary action. And you got to remember, Dad was head of the whole war as an admiral. You can see pictures here of John McCain. Someone we've already looked at. That's when they were saving his life after he landed in the lake on the two bamboo poles. The picture at the top there is John McCain coming back to the Hanoi Hilton, meeting his former guards and so forth, and how jovial everybody is. His book, Faith of Our Fathers, and that's him getting off the airplane. This is Jane Fonda visiting some of the prisoners there in the Hanoi Hilton. She was one of the war protesters that were allowed to go. That man is, I'm trying to remember John McCain's name for him, but that's him looking at the picture of him talking to the prisoners just before they left. He was the head of the POW camp there. Some of the other pictures that we've already looked at. The tape has McCain's son praising Red Doctors, but that's some of the propaganda. As you can see there, he was not part of the thing. So that is the show tonight. We're going to be doing the last part 4, and that is coming up. Let's see, July 8th is our next show, and we're finishing up John McCain, and we go on there. July 4th is coming up. Enjoy your 4th. Remember why we're having a 4th. And folks, if you live in a neighborhood and you're shooting off fireworks, if you got to shoot the fireworks off, please shoot it off all at one time or whatever. But when you do it random, it's tough for a veteran who has post-traumatic stress or just that random going off. It always seems like shots. But if you have to shoot off fireworks, just understand that there's very likely there's a veteran somewhere in the area who's having a hard time with that stuff going off. So just think about it. I'm not saying don't do it. That's why we went to Vietnam and fought, but just think about it out there. Our next show, as I said, is 8th of July. We will be finishing up. I hope you do have a great 4th. And on the July 4th, also, if you're in the Triangle area, the North Carolina Vietnam veterans will be at the Capitol in Raleigh, and they'll be doing their ceremony at 12 o'clock noon for the 4th of July, which is also the first Saturday. I've been doing it for almost 33 years now without missing the first Saturday. Come down if you have a chance and then take part. Be there for the ceremony where we call out the names of those still missing in action from the Vietnam War. And thank you very much for tuning in, and have a good night.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.